Live from New York City, Baltimore, Ohio, and Virginia. This is the 706 Podcast Productions, along with Mr. Joey Baloney and his orchestra, inviting you to join me, your host, Connor, and my guests, Anthony.
Hi.
Tony.
What's happening?
And Kirk.
You know, I tell you what, Connor, you got this guy Anthony on here. He's a real stiff. I came out, I put him in my drink. It raised about 3 blood alcohol volumes.
For another episode of the 706 Podcast. Thank you, everyone. This is the 706 Podcast, where we take a look at a movie and decide whether it is one of the 706 greatest movies of all time. I don't know what movie we're on by now. I don't know what number it is. I don't know how many we have in the 706. But we have one more on the docket for today. That would be The King of Comedy, 1983, Martin Scorsese, Paul D. Zimmerman script, film about Rupert Pupkin, played by Robert De Niro, and his ambitions to become the King of Comedy. I won't go into the whole synopsis now. I think it'll become clear what the movie's about as we discuss it. But guys, I want to hear, what did you make of the film? Is it your first time seeing it? And what was your impression watching it this time? Let's go Anthony first.
Sure. So I think I'm going to start by going off a tangent in a second. But before I get there, I just got to say, so when we talk about the King of Comedy nowadays, besides the Joker, I think the obvious point is how people often think about the movie as sort of prescient, especially the sort of celebrity culture, the obsession for fame, and how the movie almost feels a kind of decade or two ahead of its time, you know, before that culture really takes over, although it's already there, as evident by the film. And the reason I bring this up is because I just saw a movie a week ago called Spree. I don't know if anyone's seen it, but it feels like sort of descendant of this movie. It's essentially a movie that stars one of the kids from Stranger Things. And he's a guy who like is on a sort of Instagram type app, like on a live video. Mm-hmm. And he decides to kind of like go on a murder spree to try to gain internet fame, all like while he's working for this kind of Uber-like company. It's a sort of interesting movie that's often like held to like polarized reviews. And the reason I bring this up is because when I watch The King of Comedy, to me, it's very obviously a predecessor to the things that are coming out now and that came out in the 90s probably. And I say that in both a good and bad way, which is that in a good way, it's there, its influence is clear. And I find the final third of the movie still really exhilarating and very interesting. And I love the ending part when he comes out and delivers this sort of darkly humorous monologue. With that also being said, I think the first third of the movie is also the part where it kind of drags. And I get the sense of kind of discomfort. I get the kind of feeling of alienation that Robert De Niro's character really suffers, that Rupert Pupkin. And it's a very fantastic performance, but at times I'm
but that's sort of part. I mean, you're playing along with the film, yeah, getting his name wrong.
And I almost am ready just to kind of hurry it. I don't know if it's because of my impatience for it, if I'm just not. Maybe it's also the setting or something today, but yeah. So that's there as well. But I got to say, the parts where the movie really hits for me are with Jerry Lewis and Sandra Bernhard, I believe her name is.
Yeah.
When she's tying him up and delivering this monologue and singing the song, and we get this Stanley Kubrick-like lighting, you know, in the background with like this extravagantly nice New York City apartment. And I love Jerry Lewis's just deadpan sitting there reaction until he stands up. And that's really the highlight of the movie, honestly, for me. And I know it's not necessarily the most famous part and the most influential, but I just love that scene and the way it's set up. And that's just so fantastic. So I think overall, it's a solid movie. It doesn't work for me in a sort of Scorsese's best, but I've also said before, I don't know if I said it on the show or not, or outside of it, that I tend to be drawn towards Scorsese's faith projects or his religious kind of ideas more than his alienated male type movies. But there's a few parts that I want to get into, or maybe we'll bring them up, I feel like, and we'll see if maybe you guys' talk kind of brings me around to them a bit more than I currently am.
Yeah, well, thank you, Anthony. You brought up, of course, the magic word. We must admit this movie has been surpassed. Like a father is surpassed by his son, right? By Joker, of course. That goes without saying. But okay, ignoring the perfection that is Joker and the unproblematicness of it, and the sort of, just the kind of role model factor of Joker. Let's examine other things. I'm curious, how about Tony?
Yeah, this is my third time seeing this. This is very much up my alley because I am a big Scorsese fan. He's way up there for me. He's one of my all-time favorites. And what I love about him is he's had this like 50-year career at this point, but every decade of it, he churns out like at least 5 classics, or at least like 5 great movies. And they're all, and he's associated obviously with like mob movies, but he does so many different kinds of movies, so many different kinds of stories. And this is a movie that really kind of stands on its own, I think, in the Scorsese canon. I mean, obviously there's the Taxi Driver connection. Joker kind of pulled those two strands together, sort of, like the alienated kind of antisocial man who kind of goes to these great lengths to kind of get what he wants, and that's part of it. But to me, this movie is sort of prescient, not just in terms of the idea of like fame and like mass media culture. I think a lot about like tip of my tongue, I forget the term, the one-way relationships.
Parasocial.
Thank you. I completely slipped my mind. But yeah, like this movie is very much about like parasocial relationships, which is the thing we talk about more about now in the context of like Twitch streamers or YouTubers or podcasters or whatever, or some kind of like media personality that you feel this connection with, even though they don't know you exist. Obviously, those things have existed long before the internet. It's existed as long as there was like drama or fiction. But this movie, I think, really digs into that psychological phenomenon in a very cutting way. I think this is a very sharp movie. I think it's a very cutting movie, both in terms of satirizing the phenomenon of parasocial relationships, as well as just the idea of fame and celebrity. I love the characterization of Jerry Langford and how like sad his life is, how just like joyless. He's this comedy great. He's this apparently legendary guy. Like everyone recognizes him. He's a household name. He's got this super popular show, but we never really see him smile except when he's on camera. When he's just not being observed, when he's just being by himself, he looks, very sad. And I think there's 2 thematic threads that I think this movie draws out really beautifully. I think one is the character of Rupert Pupkin, I think, is an iconic character and a great character because he captures something that feels very real to me, which is the idea of wanting some epic vindication, some glorious triumph without ever thinking about what it would actually take to get there, right? So various times in the movie, we're given hints that in theory, he could make it as a comedian because his monologue at the end of the movie, like he has some good jokes. Like I laughed a few times, like he's got some good comedic timing. He's got some good comedic instincts. And throughout the movie, whenever he's getting feedback on him or his work, it sounds a little bit positive. The woman at the show, the producer's like, hey, well, go to a club, reach out to us. We'll send someone down. If I were him in that position, I'd be thrilled with that feedback. It's like, okay, that sounds a little bit positive, but he always has to take the next step because he won't settle for, slugging it in the comedy clubs. He has to just go on the Jerry Langford show. He has to be Jerry Langford. I think one very telling moment is when I forget the name of the executive producer, but she mentions like, oh, I'll give it to the executive producer. Or I asked the executive producer and he says, who? And you'd think that a guy who takes this so seriously would know who the executive producer of his favorite show is if you want to be in show business, but he has no idea because it's just Jerry Langford. That's what he wants. It's just this guy is the symbolic thing for him. And I think that there's a real psychological richness. I love the playfulness of just going in and out of the fantasy sequences. That's very much my aesthetic. And that's like the sort of thing I would like to write. I also like the idea of loneliness in this movie, I think, is very adeptly handled because I think what he's trying to do is get away from his loneliness. I think this is a very lonely, a very sad man, and his monologue at the end of the movie alludes to kind of a dark backstory or a fairly like unsatisfying childhood, a loveless childhood. And he sees this fame through Jerry Langford as being a way to redeem himself, as being a way to find human connection. But of course, everything we see of Jerry Langford indicates that he is in fact very lonely and that fame is in fact incredibly isolating. So that's not a particularly novel observation, but I think the movie draws it out very well. And I think all the main characters are really beautifully drawn. There's so many great little details. So I'm not going to go on for a million years about it, but I think this is a very prescient movie, a very sharp movie, a very funny movie. And I would put it up there with Scorsese. I'd put him in probably his top 10 just because he has so many, but yeah.
Yeah, definitely. That's a lot of thoughts, Tony. A lot of things that, yeah, definitely I would agree with. I think I see it similarly. I mean, there's one of the main things I said about this movie, right, is the prescientness of it. We can get into that in more detail, but I'm curious to hear what Kirk has to say.
Yeah, I saw this movie for the first time for this podcast. To be honest, I'm a while removed from it, but that's okay. I think harkening back to my initial thoughts on it, I thought it's kind of one of those whiteboard plots, like almost, I don't think it's incredibly well plotted or like drafted. I think the minutia, the writing, the interactions themselves are okay, but I don't think the flow and the pacing is particularly great, or I guess compelling to me. Yeah, the film itself feels like more of an idea or a social experiment than it does like a fully fleshed, well-rounded movie that you might expect from Scorsese. He's really great at character development. I think one of the areas he shines is through the use of narration. There is no narrator in this film. That's perfectly fine, but that's usually how he elucidates the narrative or the development of his protagonist. And in this film, I feel that's sorely lacking. I feel like, what kind of candid view do we receive of Rupert, really, when we think about it? What, some refracted, anecdotal presentation in his closing monologue? I mean, that's really all we get, right? We see his mom yell down a couple times. She's a voiceless. It's Scorsese's mom, by the way. I don't know if you guys know that. I could just tell by her voice. She's been in almost all his movies. I don't know. She's probably dead by now, but she was in Age of Innocence on the Jersey City Marine Terminal. She's just walking. And then, of course, she's the woman in Casino who was tapped and gave it all up, gave up Ace Rothstein. So, and
Goodfellas, when they're getting rid of the body, that she makes them food. Yeah. Probably the most famous. She's the painter, one dog looking one way, the other looking the other way. But so that was a nice throwback. And it's always kind of fun. Robert De Niro isn't necessarily a chameleon in the sense that when I watch a film with him, I know that I'm watching Robert De Niro, right? Kind of like I know I'm watching George Clooney, or I know I'm watching Brad Pitt. He's a star. He transcends the screen. So you carry with the film the baggage you have, the emotional baggage from his previous works. But I think in this film, it really worked well that he had already accrued a certain amount of fame, because especially in that really kind of depressing, desolate, or I guess forlorn sequence where he's talking with the cardboard cutouts of Liza Minnelli and Jerry Langford. He does that so well, that small talk. He has these mannerisms that he's used throughout his entire career. One moment that sticks out really in my head is at the party. What is it, Vinny Baggs, the guy who Joe Pesci stabs in Goodfellas? He's at the party, he's kind of he's touching his nose, he's kind of, touching his hair, and he's like, oh no, but you insulted him too, so let's come on, let's have a drink. He's very kind of, what's the word? Affable, I guess. He's affable. He's, at times, he can blend into the situation and kind of schmooze people, right? So I think that works well for somebody who's trying to get into such a kind of artificial business like show business, right? So it's kind of that meta narrative there. But ultimately, yeah, I think for me, the film lacked that sadness, that kind of tragic element that I really wanted. I mean, it doesn't even tell you really that he's living in New Jersey. I think that could have been explored. We could have had a scene where he's having to take a bus into New York every day to try to go to these, I think the studio's on I think it looked like 6th Avenue right by Radio City. So you could have shown that process, right? You could have shown
more of his interaction with his mother, like how's his mother doing, you know. So it just felt like kind of, oh, here's the idea. Stalker fan takes revenge on famous Johnny Carson type and turns the tables, you know, kind of really hitting on the parasocial relationship, the fanaticism, the delusion. But I think, you know, Anthony said it dragged in the beginning. I thought the best parts for me were like the office scenes where he's interacting with the secretary, where he's interacting with the assistant. It just like, it was hard to watch almost. Like there's an element of cringe there, but it's so like, ooh, it's so captivating. And I think that's where the movie really shines, is where he's very polite, but firm in an unreasonable way. And that causes friction in these situations where people are supposed to be, you know, very graceful, and then he can kind of push the boundaries, and it causes tension and it makes these other people uncomfortable. So I really like that. And yeah, I would just say it's probably not one of my favorite Scorsese's, but nonetheless, Martin Scorsese knows what he's doing. He tells the story of America so perfectly, probably the best since, what do we say, Walt Whitman, right? He's the Walt Whitman of our time. I guess he tells the story of white America. Let's just say that, mostly white America. But, you know, he's a great storyteller. He's a great thinker, innovator. And I appreciate this film. So.
No, thank you for that, Kirk. And I think there's something right about that. There's some elements of this movie that don't quite hit me, or hit me the wrong way, and I have to think about them. You know, one thing, Pauline Kael, everyone loves her, the great film critic. One thing she said, she's one of the few people kind of the sort of major critics of the time who disliked this film. It was kind of bombed at the box office. Audience didn't react very well to it, it seems. I don't know all the details, but I think in general, critics liked it. Pauline Kael had the critique that, unlike in Taxi Driver, we never really get to see who Rupert Pupkin is. And he's this kind of inaccessible, himself kind of a cardboard cutout. You know, that's one thing. I was going to mention another thing that I didn't like, just briefly. In general, I think this movie can kind of feel like, it must have been so amazing when you first saw it, simply because it was the kind of novelty of this kind of, this feeling of this cringiness, of this, we know that he's living in a delusion. He doesn't seem to know it, and he won't stop, and it keeps on driving the knife. And I think that's kind of how the first half of the movie kind of functions. And maybe that's something similar to what Anthony was saying, why that kind of doesn't work as well. I think we're more used to that. But anyway, back to Pauline Kael. She said about Rupert Pupkin that he's kind of, we never have access to him, unlike other Scorsese characters where we do have access to them. We get very up close and personal with them. This is a movie that's a little bit, very intentionally so, kind of distant, and actually in terms of its photography, quite kind of classical, very static, very restrained in a lot of ways. And I think that does serve a purpose, thinking about it again. And as I kind of watch the movie and I try to think about its different elements, I think there is a real brilliance in that we don't get close to this character for a lot of reasons. I mean, one thing I'll just say too, just on Kirk's point, I'm glad he brought up our foreknowledge of the actors, what we imagine them, from previous films, definitely, this is definitely the case for Robert De Niro, that you think of him as this tough guy, right? So odd to see him in this context. I think that also adds a certain element of menace to him that you think might be there. Like when he actually arrives at Jerry Langford's house, like he might go off, he might do something crazy, who knows, So that kind of plays into our expectations. Of course, it's hard not to find Rupert Pupkin to just be this kind of teddy bear-esque figure with an inner, sort of narcissistic kind of violence to him as well. But I think Robert De Niro's history plays a role there. Conversely, right, we have Jerry Lewis, famous comedian with Dean Martin, right, kind of part of a comic duo, which would have been sort of Scorsese's parents, favorite comedian, right? And in this film, he has the moments of the most insane kind of homicidal rage. I mean, like the real darkness in this movie comes from him, really. You would think it would be Sarah Bernhardt. You would think it would be Robert De Niro, these creepy stalkers that we're so trained to know, especially because in the decades between us and the movie, there have been so many such cases of crazy stalkers, right? We're primed to think of them as the violent ones. Really, it's it's Jerry Langford, or played by Jerry Lewis, who is the most kind of insane and frightening figure. I wouldn't quite say insane, but obviously there's an irony there. And I think it allows us to feel this kind of progression, and then it really kind of sinks in. I think, as Tony was saying, and it takes a little bit of thinking, it takes a little bit of reflection on the movie to really arrive there, that truly, this life that Rupert Pupkin is gunning for, the life of Jerry Langford, really is very sad, and he's a very sad man, right? But obviously I love that. There's a real brilliance to that, and it already encapsulates all of these things that, the kind of the general thematic things we could say about the movie. And okay, just the basic idea I throw out there in terms of my reading of the movie is it's kind of, again, it's prescient because it gives us this picture of the me generation, the boomers, where life has become such that your only ambition is simply to be loved for who you are personally. And kind of the best way to achieve that, right? What is kind of the living avatar of just personal self-expression? It is the stand-up comedian, right? You don't necessarily have any set beliefs or set ideals that you impose on others. You simply have, right, a sort of a life from which you can draw all of this meaning, right? And it'll be funny, right? You can send other people up. You can send yourself up. You can just have a laugh about yourself, and people will love you for who you are. And this is kind of part of one of his dream sequences, right? Is talking to Jerry. Jerry Lewis says to him, you've got it, and I can't take it away from you. The humor is based on you. I could never take it away from you, right? So this idea of this humor that is not an art or a skill, right, but instead is just a pure expression of the self, and people will love you purely for who you are, right? Obviously, it's a fundamentally relatable because I think we all feel it, whether you see it as a historically conditioned thing. I think maybe there's something to be said about it's a certain generation of people who felt this very deeply, and that would be maybe the kind of the me generation, right? But I think he's latched onto something that's very important. That's still kind of the reigning paradigm. And I think still a lot of us, I think up until recently, I would say there was a lot of kind of worship of stand-up comedians in a sense, right? Because I think they get to do that, or they seem to be able to do that. But somehow Scorsese anticipates this whole cultural movement. And I guess what's the place of stand-up comedians now? I don't know. But that's just my general thinking about the movie. That's kind of just my thematic entry point. And if I could just say one more thing, although, does anyone have anything to say? I don't want to monopolize the time.
I like what you said about what a comedian represents in the imagination of the public, because I think that's very true, right? It's like the purest form of expression, right? It's not mediated in any way. You're standing there on a stage and you're by yourself and you're talking to an audience, and the words you're saying are making people laugh. People are making these expressions of just joy, and you're just getting that. And it's like the greatest like high in the world, right? So it is there is something very kind of masturbatory and narcissistic. I mean, about being any kind of artist, but I think being a comedian in particular, certainly. But I do like too that the idea of like the movie shows kind of two competing views, where Jerry Langford and the people around him, when they're talking to Rupert, present comedy as being a craft. It's something you work on. It's something you hone. There's a process. There's an artistry to it, right? You have to respect it as an art form. And Pupkin completely dismisses that. He is not at all interested in comedy as a craft. Like it has nothing to do with him. It's about him, as you said. It's just like about him showing his wonderful self. And I think the fantasy sequence, Kirk said maybe he preferred, I don't know if you said you prefer voiceover, maybe you're missing what the voiceover would give you. I think the fantasy sequences have the same function in this movie as the voiceover. And I think that's a very good choice, because we get enough of Rupert talking. If we was going to do voiceover, we know exactly what he'd say. He'd say the same things he's saying to everyone else, right? He has no interiority. It's just this pure narcissism. So these fantasies, like for instance, when one of my favorite scenes in the movie is when there's the old high school principal there who apologizes to him on behalf of everyone who knew him as a kid and says, we didn't realize how much light and like meaning he brought to our lives.
We beg your forgiveness.
We beg your forgiveness. And Mary's like the high school sweetheart. And just like, as pathetic as that fantasy is, I think it's also very, relatable. I think we've all had like a fantasy like that, right? Where every person who's ever wronged us or not taken us seriously sees the error of their ways and like kisses our feet. But kind of, you can go on to what you're saying, but I like what you said about stand-up comedians. And I think that is very much on the movie's, it was a very intentionally chosen profession for the movie.
he's an unreliable narrator though. So like in past films, we trust Ray Liotta, we trust Ace Rothstein, we trust Jordan Belfort to an extent, right? We believe that they're in some sort of unambiguous state of objectivity towards the end of the film where they like know what's happening and it's like they're reflecting upon it, right? So, but we miss that because the flashback sequences or the dream sequences, the delusional instances are misleading deliberately. Like, was I not the only one who thought that sequence when they're on the Metro North, he's with the bartender? I thought that was a continuation of the dream sequence.
I think that's very much intentional. Yeah,
but so my point is like, I don't think a narration from the temporal Rupert Pupkin would have worked, but I think if we would have had someone who was a little bit more objective, it could have grounded the film and also provided some exposition. But maybe that wouldn't have worked because he's just so far gone, I guess is the point, is like he's so withdrawn into himself. He's captivated with himself and by himself. I don't know. But I don't know. I just think then we could have used his mother could have narrated the film. I don't know. It could have been.
Oh, sorry. Well, his mother dead. Like by the point, it's implied that she's.
I think he's lying about that. I personally think he's lying about his mother being dead.
Okay. He yells down to him.
Yeah, but I thought that was part of his like projection, like, and it's still within the fantasy, and it's a break, right? But it could still be part of that fantasy. But actually, well, this gets me to one point real quick. Well, before we let Connor go back to his opening. Sorry if we're hogging your time, Connor. But
no. I want you guys to talk, please.
Yeah, I'm going to throw somewhat of a wrench or somewhat of a opposite sort of claim than Tony was arguing about with the idea of work in the film. Is that one is to think about the role of the sort of stand-up comedian, is that we're still in the period of the great white male comedian. And I don't think we should also mention that. The period of Rodney Dangerfield and the George Carlin still. And we're still in that moment where, of course, like the great black comedians are still a few years away, or they're just so separate from this sort of
Pryor would have been
early 70s.
One exception, but I think with that being said, I think he does actually work, and I think he does actually practice a lot. I think the problem is the movie never lets us see it, but I think the fantasy sequences are emblematic of his like extreme practice. The problem is his practice is only about himself, and that he's only practicing for himself, because we never actually hear the tape. We never hear other than the card he hands him in the beginning with the pride and joy little joke. We get snippets of it, and it's implied that he's actually probably pretty bad, maybe, or maybe a little like mediocre even. But I think he does actually have the kind of working attitude, but the film doesn't give us the access to it.
Yeah, no, I mean, like, he's not that bad. He's just only kind of not that great. And it's sort of the anticlimax. You're hoping for something that's going to be like just terrible, but it's just like, yeah, it's fine, but yeah, does he avoid working? I mean, the thing about Rupert Pupkin is he's kind of weird. If you compare him to Joker, if we're going to remake, sorry to bring up Joker. Originally it was a joke, of course. I was making lots of jokes about Joker, but of course, to compare it, I think obviously the temptation was there from the beginning. Our character, our dreamer, should be a total loser, like he should be a failure on multiple levels, right? Rupert Pupkin seems like a rather put together guy. He's a rather functional guy, which I don't know. I'm not sure what that means or why it has to be. I think maybe there's something like an arbitrary distinction between him so that they don't feel like they're worlds apart, so that Jerry Langford and Rupert Pupkin don't feel like they're that different. Maybe it's trying to establish that parallelism between them. But I've lost the thread of what you're saying, Anthony. Does that answer in any way what you said, or would you like to just what was your major takeaway that ultimately that the art is there in Rupert Pupkin? He does seem to work hard.
I think so. I think, or at least partly. I think the problem is the idea, if to follow kind of Tony's idea about art and work, and the idea that the film sort of outlines that comedy is this art that you're kind of working towards, or that you need to be working towards, like anything. Like it reminds me is like, the big joke of people who talk about writing, for instance, that if you want to be a good writer, you write every day type attitude. And there's sort of the pathos here about it. But I think Rupert does work at the craft. The problem is his work is only so personal, and he never exposes himself to the public. because he thinks that the way to gain the public is just to immediately capture the fame. And I think that's a more interesting, more cynical view about art in itself, that your art doesn't matter because we get the laugh track in it. But the fact is once you're in the spotlight, people will flock to you anyway.
I think that's great. I think that's a great point, Anthony, honestly. And I think it's right on target for what the movie I think is going for. Yeah, absolutely right. That the thing I was going to add to my opening monologue was just a basic observation about the movie, that notice when, for instance, we have Sarah Bernhardt, who's a hard character to kind of square with Rupert Pupkin. Rupert Pupkin is kind of maybe using Jerry Langford as a figure that he emulates, right? Sarah Bernhardt is the real sort of traditional stalker who is obsessed with Jerry Langford in many ways, right? Including sexually, right? Or interested in him, right? Notice, right, when we have the scene of their dinner, their candlelit dinner, which is a horrible, kind of borderline sexual assault scene, right? And unnerving, right? Sarah Bernhardt, the character Masha, is having this candlelit dinner with apparently her idol, her hero, her, ideal lover, whatever. And she never asks him anything at all, right? She's only talking about herself the entire time, and what she has to say is great. It's one of my favorite moments too. And it's such a great pendant. Just that one moment alone kind of contains all the multitudes of Rupert Pupkin as well. But ultimately, it's all about her and her shortcomings and her desires and her inabilities to transcend herself, right? And somehow, really, in the end, Jerry Langford is just a sounding board against which she can express herself, right? And similarly, I think instead of that sounding board being Jerry Langford for Rupert Pupkin, instead it's the audience, right? But the audience doesn't matter at all. You don't really need any feedback from the audience. You just need a laugh track. You need the sound of something. You just know the audience is there. I think obviously the movie always refuses to show you the audience in the scene where he first is about to give and we never hear his monologue, right? We just see the cutout of the crowd, static, right? Certainly when he actually gives it on TV, right? We don't see a crowd. We barely see a reaction. The only reactions we do see are of the people who are in his immediate, basically this empty bar where Rita, his love interest, works. Yes, I think fundamentally, right? Yeah, the kind of self-reflexiveness of it. This is all about yourself. This is kind of the shortcoming. This is how it differs from, the true comedian, right? And this is sort of where he goes wrong. However, of course, like we have to ask ourselves too, could the same thing kind of be happening? Is Jerry Langford really any different, right? Is he someone who really did or just work hard, right? Just make it. And I think he did to some extent. But I think the movie is saying at the same time that even though they're different, they're really not so different in that, how should I put this? Maybe, okay, this is kind of going on a limb. I don't think the movie quite justifies this, but how the movie ends, and Kirk brought this up too, right? The dream sequences were ambiguous. It ends with, and funnily enough, it ends with a voiceover narration, apparently of a TV, kind of reporter or something saying, Rupert Pupkin, when he was released from prison, had this, great comeback, and now he's a star, right? And all this. So this is exactly what Rupert Pupkin wants. Therefore, we imagine that it must be a dream. And certainly when we see the television program that he seems to be starring in, it seems to be just a cheering crowd, him standing there saying nothing, right? Which again is kind of the desire for pure adulation rather than interest in craft, right? That he just wants to be loved for himself, just adored by an audience for doing nothing, right? So it seems to be a fantasy. But at the same time, right, you could take it as being real, and the fact that there's an element too of kind of satire, right? That he would have sold his story that he could, if he gets only 10 minutes of fame, he's in the spotlight, therefore he doesn't really need to do anything else after that. There's just an intrinsic fascination with him, right? Which again, maybe explains kind of, maybe itself the movie is kind of critiquing or trying to make a point about real celebrity culture, which is kind of produced by it finds people like Pupkin, right, and kind of elevates them to become the Jerry Langfords of the world, thereby perpetuating the cycle, right? That would eliminate the idea of the difference between Langford and Pupkin and the importance of craft. But and just to put a cherry on top, of course we could say, right, I mean, now we live in a world where, right, I think the line between the Jerry Langford and the Pupkin figure, right, is definitely blurred in that we have, instead of television, which plays a huge role, like the medium of television is very essential to the plot of this movie, right? we have instead, right? The internet and these many minor celebrity figures who are themselves, kind of minor people in a larger ecosystem. And I have nothing intelligent to say about it, just that, just to draw a parallel. But anyway, I don't know if you guys have any thoughts on any of it.
That's really good, Connor. I think you hit on a lot of really important stuff. I do like the idea of like audience not being real or never being seen or whatever, because they're probably the best shot in the movie is him. I think it's supposed to be him recording his tape or rehearsing or something. And he's standing in this like hallway, and it's very dreamlike because it is very Kubrickian because it doesn't look like anyone's basement. It almost looks like it's an art museum or something. And he's standing before this big mural, this big like canvas showing these like black and white laughing faces. And it's like he has the celebrity cardboard cutouts, but he also has this mural of like audience faces. So to him, both the celebrities who are his gods, his idols, and the adoring fans, none of them are actually real, which I think reinforces his isolation, right? They're just faces on a wall. They're just images to him. It's all just like, it's very like solipsistic. And you have that nice pull back in that hallway, and we can't make out what he's saying. It's drowned out by this like laugh track, right? Which further underscores the fact that like the material itself doesn't matter. But I think what I like about the ending, and I think what's so satirically cutting about it, I'm coming around to this, is for one, I do think it is real. I do think it being real is more satisfying on a narrative level and on a satirical level. And I think that basically in this debate about craft, in this debate between Jerry Langford and Rupert Pupkin about what comedy means, because they do have kind of a debate, right? They don't actually formally debate, but in their tense conversations, you get a sense that they're positing two different visions of like how to be a successful comedian. Because Jerry Langford says, you got to work at it. You got to hit the clubs. You got to do you got to polish your material. And Rupert Pupkin says, no, I just want to make a big spectacle of myself. I want to cut in front of the line, right? And we're inclined as the audience, because obviously Jerry Langford is the successful comedian and also a lot more sensible and rational, that he's right. But the point of the ending is that Rupert Pupkin was in fact right all along, that Jerry Langford is essentially jerking himself up and making him seem like, oh, I'm so great. I'm this polished, respectful artist. I paid my dues. But Rupert Pupkin shows what a sham it all is by he doing this criminal act, this obscene, ridiculous thing. And he ends up in the exact same position at the end of the movie as Jerry Langford was. He didn't have to hustle in the clubs for years. He didn't have to do any of that. He had to do this criminal conspiracy with this woman to get it. So in a way, the movie is deeply satirical and showing that fame is essentially arbitrary. It's not a meritocracy. It's not as though the hardest working people, the most legitimate people, the most respectable people, the best people will get ahead. It's totally chaotic. It's like when I think Tony Randall says in his audience to the audience, like, well, I mean, it's ultimately up to you. And that's just it. It's up to you. It's up to the audience. And what the audience likes is it's often stupid. It's often random. It's like there's no way to predict it. So I think that's where the movie ultimately kind of comes down. And I do think it is an effective and pretty funny satirical note to end the movie on.
I don't know how grounded in reality that is, though. Like that kind of conception of fame, right? Like that feels like what an embittered kind of Juilliard flunk out would say, right? Like, oh, it's so arbitrary. Like that's what I said. That's what I say when I play Smash because I suck ass. I say it's arbitrary, right? Like it's not arbitrary. It's a war of attrition. It's a war of talent and networking. And yeah, I mean, there are some instances, but like, I think that feeds into the delusion is the idea that it's arbitrary. And yeah, I just don't know where I come down on that. But I think I agreed with what you said earlier about the idea that Rupert wants to kind of bypass. He wants to bypass the hard work. It's not like he's this kind of omniscient entity that understands he has this grand master plan. All of his actions are born of insecurity and loneliness and self-serving necessity, right? Like he doesn't have any grand plan about, oh, well, Jerry Langford's famous for an arbitrary reason, so I'm just going to create a stunt and then I'll be as famous as him. I mean, I think he's delusional. Like he's actively delusional. He's not like surveying the media landscape and realizing there's a weakness. But I think this movie is even more true nowadays with like the emergence of YouTube, that general theme that you're talking about, the kind of the feeling of like the inversion between of work and success with YouTube. You look at like some kids who open toys or like open Disney products, and they have tens of millions of views. And then that can, I think that's even more true now, but I'm not sure how true that was in the 70s, outside of, I will put a huge disclaimer, issues regarding race and gender. Of course, that goes with, I guess it doesn't go without saying, but it's any well-intentioned person will realize that we're talking about white comedians here, white male comedians. Like, that's the quote unquote rat race that we're evaluating, because that's the only race that really exists in this scenario. So, but I don't know, man. You guys,
I think the movie's saying a version of that, even if it's not on 100%. It's a satire. It's an exaggeration, right? It's not saying that like literally these are equally valid ways to become famous comedians. I don't think that's literally true.
Yeah,
but I think there's an element of chaos. There's an element of randomness. There's an element of luck to it, of course. And I think making a spectacle, I think what Rupert understands, and I don't think he's this master planner who like understands this in a deep way. I think it's much more intuitive. I think it comes out of, in the same way, like Donald Trump, for instance, I think he's just doing what he wants out of his just pure id, right? But it got him where it got him, right? Because that's what America wanted at that particular moment, right? So I think that basically he understands on some level the idea of the spectacle, the value of the spectacle, the idea of like this grand, crazy thing that people can gawk at, I think that is a valuable thing. I don't want to say valuable. I'm not saying like doing this is a valuable thing. I'm saying that like to American audiences, right? Like we love to gawk at these crazy people. So anyway.
Yeah, I think to back up your point a little, Tony, is we have to remember when the guest list is coming out, the writer, the one who spent years researching China and Russia, is the first one they cast off. So it
Vanishing Siberian Tiger.
Yeah, that claim, right? And it's interesting there, but also it's very short and it's very quick. I had to actually do a double take because I wanted to hear the list of celebrities that were supposed to be on the show that day. And we get Gore Vidal, who's extremely famous for his, kind of controversial and reactionary opinions at the time, and a talk show like Magnet for that reason, more so than his novels, and much more remembered for that now than his novels. We get Shelley Winters, who's the sort of screen legend at the time, and a throwback to A Raisin in the Sun for Kirk. And we get Tony
Raisin.
Bennett. Sorry, A Place in the Sun. I just completely mix those two up. But we get Tony Bennett at the end, who's arguably the only one of that list, maybe with Shelley Winters, who has pure talent, but also spectacle at the same time of why they're on that show. But everyone there has this really dramatic reason that gets people excited. And the writer doesn't, because his is the long work that spent years to be done. And it doesn't have the kind of pizzazz that Tony's talking about for the show.
But how are we to know that that guy was actually a writer? That's my question. I don't understand. Like, why can't there be two frauds?
You thought he was a communist spy, Kirk?
I mean, it's just so disorienting, the whole movie in that sense. Like, what am I believing? It's this shell game, right? But yeah, I can see where the tides are headed, and I would just say I think I align with there being a kernel of truth to that, but I don't think Scorsese would put all his. I don't think he's such a one-note guy. He's not really like a one-note guy there. And I think he's a little more nuanced. And I think it might even be like he wants us to appreciate the perspective of Pupkin, who believes it's arbitrary. And then, the irony between that and what we have. I don't know. It's hard to say.
I would say, Kirk, as we wrap up, I would say Pupkin doesn't think it's arbitrary. He thinks it's about him and his intrinsic Pupkinness, right? He doesn't think it's arbitrary. Our author, Scorsese / Zimmerman, is kind of, if we take the ending as being real and it's satirical, that person, that voice is saying, and yes, this is how show business really works. It's not about hard work either. It's not about the inner self. It's not about hard work. It's about what the audience, morbidly craves, right?
I think that's a much better way of putting what I was trying to say. I agree with that. Yeah.
But now let's get to the voting. I wonder, Kirk, would you go first just because you had the last word a little bit? I think you were on a roll with what you were saying. just to bring
No,
back.
that's fair. Yeah, no, I guess you're right. You know, the idea of arbitrariness. I guess he feels it's unjust is right, a better term than arbitrary, but that he's not famous. So this is a little bit tough for me. I guess I kind of harken back to the images that, you know, have stuck with me of him sitting with the cardboard cutouts, him in the office with the receptionist, his interaction with the assistant producer. I think even like the payphone sequence in Times Square is kind of, you know, a little hidden gem. And I really think this is a great performance. It's an exceptional performance and a show of versatility, I guess, flexibility. What's the word I'm trying to look for? Like, you know, he's amenable to different situations. Amenable. Yeah, I don't know what I'm trying to say really, but I think this has got to be in the 706. So I'll say yes.
Well, thanks, Kirk. Anybody else? Anthony, maybe? I think we know where Tony's going. Although maybe, hold on, Anthony. Let's go with Tony because I think he was positive from the get-go. Maybe Anthony still has doubts. Let's keep the audience in suspense. Makes for a better show.
All right. Well, yes, I am. I'm an easy yes. I'd say in addition to everything I've already said. I mean, I do think this is one of those movies that is it's really chewy. You know, I think in addition to being, it strikes a good balance for me because there's movies that are like chewy, like for me, like Transit, right? Like it's chewy in the sense that there's a lot of interesting stuff in it, but it doesn't like, you know, have the verve and the spark and then keep my attention the whole way through. This is a movie that's incredibly fun. It's breezy, it's exciting, it's surprising, but it's full of like fascinating little details. Just two things real quick that we didn't really talk about. The Sandra Bernhard character. What an amazing character. I love the little glimpse we get of her backstory. The fact that she apparently is like incredibly wealthy. She's obviously someone's kid, but she had like a miserable childhood, and just that context I think is so interesting. Like she is more interesting than she had to be. I'll say that. And also, I think another satirical point, kind of parallel to the other one that we've kind of drawn out here, is that the pursuit of fame, the pursuit of entertainment and art requires some degree of self-delusion. And I do think that's 100% true. And I think this movie just takes that to its furthest possible extreme. So I would say easy yes.
I will just add that the Sandra character, she's the CFO of Goldman Sachs. It's actually revealed at the end. No, I'm kidding. But wouldn't that be a twist? Wouldn't that be really good?
Okay, we had 2 votes, so now there's not much suspense, but this now gives Anthony a chance to be the dissenting opinion.
Okay, so in terms of voting, I got to say one is Tony took it too far with that transit line, because this is the opposite case for me. Is the King of Comedy to me is not exactly a fun, breezy, chewy little movie to dig into. It's actually quite uncomfortably annoying at times. Let's just throw that out. But one thing I will say, because we all threw in something about Sandra Bernhard's Marsha character, I find it really fascinating how we're so quick to assume that Rupert is sort of unstable and possibly in these fantasy sequences, and we have this kind of willingness to go along with the sort of kernel of how reliable and reliable he is. And part of that is because the movie directly gives us these feelings of being in a dream world. But with Sandra and her story, I also wonder how reliable her backstory is when she gives it. Because I find it interesting that when we see her apartment, we know it's this huge apartment. We don't know what she does officially. We're kind of curious, but the apartment itself feels like a dream. And I described the Kubrickian Barry Lyndon-like feel to the candles. And that does not feel real to me at all. I feel like when we get her story, we get this really, in a perverse way, a perverse male fantasy of what we would expect that type of woman to kind of be like, which is the sort of virginal, celebrity obsessed, caricature of that late 70s, early 80s type woman. And I think, for our Patreon subscribers, we got to do a commentary track just about those scenes. So, donate $5 a month and they will be there, or buy merch from our Etsy store.
Anthony, that's actually the Simon Killer tier. That's $100 a month. So
yeah.
Sorry.
You donate the Simon Killer tier, we will go with you to France. And I know.
Thank you, Anthony, for plugging the Patreon there. God knows we need it.
I think at the final point is I think this is a very soft yes for me for reasons that I liked what we talked about. I think we could do a whole other episode or two on this movie. So it's interesting and it's a good choice.
Sure. No, I thank you, Anthony. I'm quite pleased with the juice that we got out of this particular fruit. Thank you, everyone. I'm sorry for the metaphor there. It didn't quite come off as well as it sounded in my head. Now, just one more thing. When the principal comes on, and in this fantasy sequence, the principal's on, Rupert Pupkin turns to, he was your principal. You gave me lots of bad grades. And then he turns to Jerry Langford, Rupert Pupkin does, and says, "You're having him on, but he's an enemy." Like the fact that he says, "But he is an enemy," as a spelling out the subtext of his own show. It's just, there's great moments like that. Like the awkwardness, the slight mediocrity of Rupert Pupkin's fantasies is very fun. Okay, guys, thank you very much. Now we move on to the next segment, the fan favorite, the segment where you suggest and I get to choose which one we'll watch for next time. Let's see, who went who went least recently?
Anthony.
I did.
Anthony. So Anthony, you get the pick.
I'm going to choose to go last. I'm going to have, if it's okay, Kirk go first, then Tony, and then me.
So I'm going to nominate Def Jam's Kings of Comedy. No, I'm kidding. I almost wish we had watched that because that's really funny. Let's see. I got a banger. I'm unsure who's seen it. It could be anywhere from 0 to 3, honestly, in terms of which one of you have seen it, which people. But I'm going to suggest a movie from last year that really, I saw it a little over a month ago, and it's really stuck with me throughout this time. And honestly, if I were to give a fair assessment of it, I would say it's one of the best movies I've seen in the past decade, including the 2010s all the way back. It's Sound of Metal, 2020, starring Riz Ahmed. It's a movie about, well, it's hard to describe, but the thing happens, the basic conceit of the movie happens right away, I guess. So it's okay to say, but it's a metal drummer in a band who begins to lose his hearing. And the movie just follows that crisis as it unfolds. It's incredibly painful and visceral. It's a naturalistic movie, but it has some high aspirations as well. Kind of keeps you, its intentions, I guess, there in the higher areas. There's some philosophical elements, there's some really like viscerally painful elements, but ultimately it's just so endearing, and I would love to talk about it. If I think it's kind of fun that Oscar season's coming up, and I think this is like a dark horse, so we'll see what happens. But yeah, that's my pick.
For philosophical, painful, endearing.
Yes.
This is intriguing. How about Tony? What do you got for us?
I'll give you a choice, Connor. Do you want superheroes or disgraced sex criminal politicians?
That's a tough one. I would probably have to go for the politician.
Okay, so there's a documentary I saw this one in the theater, so it had to have been like 2016. Yeah, 2016.
We're talking Wiener here.
We're talking Wiener. We're talking Wiener. This is actually one of my favorite documentaries. It was made for Showtime, but it was a theatrically released film. It's not a TV movie per se, but basically follows the disgraced New York politician Anthony Weiner, and it's like kind of it's not done in the past. It's fly on the wall, so to speak. It's as the things are happening. It's him running for mayor of New York City, and they're making this documentary about him. And this big sexting scandal happens while they're filming the documentary. It's a very like cringe-inducing, anxiety-inducing, but also like hilarious movie. And I'm really curious to see how it plays like 5 years later. I just think it's a very like entertaining film, and also just I don't know. I think you guys would get a kick out of it if you haven't already seen it. And it is a genuinely great documentary.
Wow. Yeah. I have no words. Anthony, please give me an exit here.
All right, those are some interesting choices. I think a couple weeks ago, I don't remember if it was in the recording, but Kirk sort of issued a cri du coeur for the podcast. He asked us, when are we going to do the Citizen Kanes and the whatever of the worlds? So I'm going to throw out a big one. Normally, I would go with sort of the transits or the kind of less well-known movies of the kind of big names. But I realized that we're on episode 60 today. The next one's going to be episode 61. And it seems a shame that we haven't done an Alfred Hitchcock movie. And I'm going to pick one that I know Tony hadn't seen, at least last time we talked. I'm going to pick 1959's North by Northwest, sort of gargantuan of the adventure film drama. It stars Cary Grant as a kind of government agent who's mistaken for a spy and ends up on the run from James Mason. It's one of the most interesting kind of Alfred Hitchcock movies. It's kind of, I feel like, less talked about than the Rear Windows or Psychos of that period, but still really big. Very interesting, very solid overall movie. And I think it holds up perfectly today.
Oh my God, guys, this is quite a selection. I am definitely pulled in all directions here. I will say that I have seen Wiener, but I would watch it again because I remember distinctly my experience of watching it.
How was it? Was it long or was it
not very long?
Okay. That's what I thought. I mean, we're talking about Tony,
but guys, please, can you rebut each other and allow me, just give me something so I can help, I can make my decision here?
Yeah, when I'm thinking, oh man, I know a lot of people have seen Tony's Wiener, but I just, it doesn't really strike me as something, as something that's appealing to a large audience. I don't know, and with these court cases coming up surrounding the Wiener, I think might be a good idea to steer clear. And Anthony, if I don't want to see the documentary about the failed indie music festival in Seattle called North by Northwest, trying to crib South by Southwest. It's a little boring, but Sound of Metal, I'm curious. I don't know who's seen it. That'd be interesting to find that information out. Connor, have you seen it? Most importantly, I guess.
No.
Oh my goodness, none of you have seen it.
We already did a Julie Andrews movie, Kirk.
What? Oh, did I say Sound of Music?
No.
Okay. No, it's oh man. I really think there's an interesting conversation to be had about like how we can properly evaluate films that have recently come out. Like, do we have the ability to correctly value them and see them in their historical perspective? And I think that's a conversation to be had. I think looking at this particular way of filmmaking and looking at how disabilities are portrayed in films, or I guess, hearing impediments, that's a whole conversation. And just, it could kind of almost be like looking ahead to what is next on the frontier in filmmaking. Are these A24 type movies, this is particular an Amazon Studios movie, but are they perhaps falling by the wayside for more genre pieces, for superhero films, for are these original screenplays kind of going the way of the dodo? So that would be another conversation to have. But I really do implore you to see it if it doesn't get chosen, because this film is really, really gripping, and it brought me to tears. So,
well, as for Anthony's film, I don't need to see Kanye West's vanity project about his children. All right. And then for Sound of Metal, we already watched Sound of Music. I don't have a joke for that one. No, actually, I really do want to watch Sound of Metal. It just got a bunch of Oscar nominations, and from what I've heard of it and seen of it, I kind of suspect I'm going to really like it, just aesthetically and the trailer and everything. Riz Ahmed, great actor. He's in Four Lions, one of my all-time favorites. He's great in that movie as well. So I'd be very happy to pick that. And North by Northwest, I like Kirk. I would like to see some more big old classics on here. I think it's good to do that every now and then. I still have not seen North by Northwest. It's a big gap of mine and my Hitchcock knowledge. So eager to check that one out. I guess for Wiener, my main pitch would just be it's very fun. It's a very fun and funny movie to watch. Genuinely, I mean that's utterly sincerely. I think it's just kind of a fascinating little glimpse at the moment in modern political history and this figure who's not forgotten exactly, but he had made a very particular impression at a certain moment. It's also interesting too that it came out in 2016. We obviously know what happened in that election, and sort of this idea of like kind of there being no taboos in politics anymore, while in some ways feeling like there are more. So it's kind of a weird, I think it speaks to kind of a cultural thing that we're still kind of grappling with. And I think that also, like, I think we should do more documentaries. You know, I don't know. We've done one, but I think we're due for another one. So.
All right, interesting. I think Tony hit the nail on the head that, you know, we haven't really done many documentaries. I think we did the Adam Curtis one, and that's it, maybe one more, if I'm not remembering right. So maybe that's an interesting choice. I don't really feel too excited by it, but maybe the documentary will bring me back to 2015, 2016, when that was kind of the joke on our campus, at least. And so that might be interesting. I think Kirk made the best pitch for that movie, because my initial thought about it, and I haven't seen it, is I love Riz Ahmed, but from the trailer and from what I read about it, it just sounded like the type of movie that I just agonize myself to bring, the sort of slow, sort of dramatic film festival, like A24 vibe that just does not usually work for me. So, you know, I'd be willing to go in and really hope that I get into it the way, you know, Kirk obviously has and had that personal feeling towards. North by Northwest, maybe it's kind of a boring choice. Maybe it's an easy in, maybe not at the same time. Maybe there'd be some dissenting things. I think my main pitch for that would be, as everyone said, though, to kind of get back to some of the bigger titles and pull us back into the past a bit more.
Guys, you rebutted each other fiercely to the best of your abilities, and yet I'm still sort of at a loss. But here's what I'll say. Wiener, very appealing. Very appealing film. Of course, I'm very fond of it. And in the last moments, even Anthony made a good case in its favor, almost returning to that moment. There is an interesting context that has been gained in the time between us and Wiener, of course. Obviously, something I recommend everyone to see if they have a certain fascination with a certain kind of psychology. One of the most just unbelievable cases of kind of just pure self-destruction, you know, ever. It's fascinating and sad, but I'm going to eliminate it. And I also say there's an element of prejudice against documentaries here. Honestly, I'm like, what can we say about a documentary? How much are we going to be talking about the art form, the construction, the creation, what it has to say about our world versus the details of Wiener's personal foibles and misbehaviors, indiscretions, I should say. So I admit there's a tension there. I'm going to eliminate Wiener. Of course, guys, of course, we need to go to the past. Of course, we need to revisit the greats of history, right? You know, that's where my heart lies. I'm all about the past. However, we're going to go with Sound of Metal because Kirk made a great case. It appealed to me immediately. How interesting. Something from last year. I just think the time is right. We're in Oscar season. It feels right. We're going to bring a lot of people into the podcast, get a lot of people subscribing to the Body of Lies tier of the podcast Patreon. I'm really excited for that. So let's go.
Body of Lies tiers, we give them money, so we don't want that.
So let's do it.
Cool. I'm excited.
Yeah, I'm excited for you guys. This is the most confident I've been in a choice since Come and See. So I'm very excited for this. And thank you, Connor. I appreciate your trust. And I am anticipating a hard-fought battle with Anthony where he comes up with all his contrarian takes, but we're going to take him on head first. And I know Tony will be my lackey throughout, so I'll have him to fight with.
Who knows where I'll stand?
Yeah.
I'm fascinated, Kurt.
I'll have what she's having.